There's an interesting overview window here we have before us to discuss cosmic sociology and galactic game theory. And I'm particularly excited to welcome back to our channel three great minds to discuss this matter. Robin Hanson, who's an economist and a blogger at Overcoming Bias, who's wrote a number of, about a huge amount of things, some of them including The Great Filter, Burning the Cosmic Commons, and more recently, the Grabby Aliens hypothesis. Anders Sandberg, who's a futurist polymath, jack of so many trades, I'd say even more than a jack, and he's at the Future of Humanity Institute, who is writing a book, Grand Futures, and we've discussed that previously on this channel as well. And Joscha Bach, who's an AI researcher and cognitive scientist and author of Principles of Synthetic Intelligence, who also has some very interesting ideas about the long-term future, combating entropy, for instance. So, yes, let's dive right in. So we're here to explore the intersections and in some case, maybe even fault lines of science fiction, each of the panelists' areas of expertise here, considering the rich interplay of advanced civilisations, existential risks, and strategic decision-making that Citroën-Lew's three-body problem discusses. How do you think the novel's portrayal of cosmic sociology and interstellar strategic dynamics reflects our challenges? Furthermore, in what ways can these fictional narratives inform our approach to future technological and ethical challenges?
I'll say that basically most of us are jolly just thrilled that these very issues get mentioned at all in a sort of fiction that many people are listening to. We're going to be pretty forgiving on that. It's also somewhat of a throwback to sort of old style science fiction, as it sort of takes the history of civilization as a character in a story seriously and has these grand issues and grand narratives. That's out of fashion today. Maybe only some foreigner who used to read us can bring that back. So I love all those elements, but I do have some nits about the actual details. We can be forgiving about them because it's actually presenting the issues at least to a wider audience, but the specifics are a bit off.
It's a bit like Star Trek. It used to be said that every time Star Trek had a new television series, the number of engineering students a few years later picked up. And that is despite the fact that most episodes of Star Trek were not necessarily pro-technology. Actually, quite a lot of them were very critical to use against using technology, and usually the technology went wrong, and much of the science was totally made up. So I think in many ways, the three-body problem, it contains so many cool ideas. They don't fit together, but they are going to make people enthusiastic about cool ideas. And then maybe, hopefully, we can put them together into slightly larger conglomerations that make a bit more sense.
In many ways, this reads like a novel from the modernist times of the West, of the US or Germany, stuff that was written between the 1920s and the 1960s, where you have strong belief in the ethics of scientists, for instance, that is seen in the three-body problem that is completely implausible to somebody who sees the current state of academia. And there are, of course, a lot of issues with the way in which the story is written. And I agree with Robin that there are details which don't make a lot of sense, like the way in which the aliens preserve their human level or their humanness. It's clear that they're not human because they live on a planet that's extremely different climate and conditions, but they have not made a transition to AGI, for instance. And AGI is not an issue for them. And it's interesting why that is the case. On the other hand, they have all this superb technology that they developed. I think main achievement of the three-body problem is an answer to the question of the great filter. That is a very obvious answer, yet one that is pretty under-discussed. And it's one that is confronting the normal optimism that our civilization used to have about contacting other civilizations, sending Voyager probes, sending signals out into space with some kind of deep existential pessimism. And it's a type of pessimism that makes a lot of sense. It's something that is very difficult to argue against, I believe. And
I think I beg to differ on that.
I'll beg to differ.
Great, we will have a discussion. We will have disagreement.
We can explore. Well, yes, AI is taken off stage, and it seems as though a lot of authors have expressed concerns in being able to craft a narrative around what happens after a singularity or an intelligence explosion. I remember Vroma Strain, who recently passed away, unfortunately, came up with the concept of zones of thought to sort of talk about the different speeds at which different areas of the cosmos could compute. And that way could take off stage AI and the implications of what happens after an intelligence explosion. So yes, particularly difficult.
So I think this is also a narrative issue. So the collection of his short stories, True Names and Other Dangers, is a really interesting one, because there is his own commentary about how he's trying to solve the problem of writing about super intelligent entities from various angles. You can kind of see how he's struggling as a smart author who doesn't want to, on one hand, leave out stuff he thinks is relevant, but yet come up with conceits that make for a good story. And this is, of course, the eternal problem in writing really good science fiction, because you want to tell a story, but reality doesn't have that obligation. Many of the things in reality don't lend themselves to the kind of stories we would like to tell. Now, the problem here might be that actually a really great storyteller can take even very boring facts and turn them into something amazing. But most writers just want to write a story straight away and have the readers really like it. It's very rare when you get that totally unique perspective. So that means, of course, fiction brings things up and might stretch our minds. But then it also has to constrain itself, because otherwise it's not going to be very good reading.
Yeah, I think that the biggest problem with the three-body problem is trying to engage these issues of different alien civilizations and how far away they could see each other and whether they'd be hiding from each other. And then it's trying to cram it into this human story. So it picks the nearest star to be the one where other aliens are. And it's a very difficult place for life to survive. So it survives there. So you've got to figure if it's there and here, it's pretty much everywhere. So the whole premise that you don't know where life might be and you have to hide to pretend you don't have it, it doesn't really work, because it would just be everywhere. If it's in these two places, it would be, at least in 1% of everywhere else around. And, the thing was, let's find a better place to go with a better set of, orbits or whatever. You could just see that from a long way. You don't need to know if there's aliens there to know that those planets have nicer orbits, if that's what you want. So the whole idea that three-body people are, Earth has great orbits, let's go take over. Like, they wouldn't need to hear a signal from Earth to know about that. And even telescopes of the sort they would certainly have would tell them plenty about what planets there were and what sort of atmospheres and temperatures they were at and all that sort of thing. So but he needed to make this human level story, even though it's going to spread it over several centuries. That's like, he's going to take the nearest star and put civilization on that and have them and us have issues with each other, and even that's going to take many centuries to play out. But he wants to tell the story of what happens when aliens interact and have it be within a few centuries, which is just kind of impossible, really. But you got to give him credit for, okay, if you're going to have to tell a story, I guess that's what you have to do.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to put things into a parallel universe. If you read Stanislav Lem's philosophical science fiction, he typically makes one of two decisions. Either he makes it funny and satirical, like the Star Diaries, which do not try to be realistic, but try to explore lots of interesting thought experiments, like creating the universe using a positron that bounces off the Big Bang and then turns into an electron and goes the other way. In this way, you weave the entire universe and design it. It's a beautiful idea. Or he has the stuff that is more realistic, and it's always bleak. Like the Futurist Congress, you go into the future until it's really not nice anymore, and you have no way to relate. Or his master's voice, you detect messages from aliens, but there's no way you can understand them. Or you go to another planet to find another distant civilization, and there is no way you can relate to them because they're intelligent worms and there is nothing you have in common. Or you take Solaris, this thinking planet that is so alien that there is no way for us to find any common ground with it. And it's just a big enigma. And these stories are philosophically very interesting, but they don't go very far in terms of human-alien interaction. And Vroma Strain changes physics to make it possible to constrain AI to certain regions of the universe and to constrain super fast life travel to some regions of the universe and make them all interact. And this gives him this opportunity to explore all sorts of minds. But I don't think that's the purpose of the three-body problem. Right? The three-body problem starts out with this interesting mathematical idea of the three-body problem that it persists on for a pretty long time. And while it's an interesting idea, it seems to be completely unrelated or mostly unrelated to the rest of the plot. It seems one idea that he had that he wanted to mix in and then goes into in great detail. Then we have this plot of the scientists killing themselves, and you waste a lot of time thinking about what's going on here and so on. But after all, it's not super interesting because it's all meant to say, okay, the aliens have captured our physics to stop our development. And the actual interesting idea is simply this, that there is always a shortage of real estate in the universe. There's always a shortage of good waterfront properties and so on. So there will never be a post-scarcity universe like in the Ian Banks novels. And this means shut up unless they find out that you have good waterfront property and they're going to take it from you.
Yeah,
So
we'll
in
say
many
that I've
ways,
heard that
game theory that might be the really interesting core here.
Which theory?
The game theory, the basic questions about interstellar sociology, although I would rather say it's the game theory and strategic issue. And in many ways, that is carrying the story. The individuals and the big explosions are much less interesting than actually the challenges.
So a key technical assumption for his game theory is that it's possible to send a message to all the local stars without knowing where it came from. Which sounds kind of implausible to me, but that's what sets up the game. So you can just say, hey, everybody over there, go smash them, and then they might, without revealing where you came from. And obviously, in some sense, if you sent out a probe far enough and then it broadcast from there, you might not know where it came from. But in the story, they don't have to bother to do that. There's somehow a way to broadcast a message where nobody will see where it came from.
And the interesting part here is that this ties it strongly to physics. Some laws of physics might allow this, some laws of physics might not allow it. So electromagnetic radiation, for example, has this funny property that, well, if you make an antenna to broadcast a signal, that is also a receiver. You can kind of just time reverse things. So in many cases, you can actually analyze the capabilities of communication, and you can talk about how detectable is where a communication is coming from. And in the electromagnetic field, it generally seems that, okay, it's very directional. It's very hard to make a message that seems to come from nowhere in particular. If you could bounce electromagnetic beams from objects like planets and stars, now you could do interesting other things that might be harder to track. And then, of course, depending on the physics assumption, what other forces you have in your story, you might end up with a universe that allows you to do non-attributable messaging, which would allow a lot of people to be chatting without actually any particular danger, because you can't find out where they're hiding. But you could have a galactic internet, even if everybody is hiding from everybody else.
Would this also work with weaponization? Would you be able to, pot shot somebody from afar without anybody knowing where the gun was hiding?
Well, that depends a little bit on the physics. So if you want to use a laser, then it's very, very directional. And I've been thinking a little bit about Dyson-Nichols laser. So you build a Dyson sphere around a star, you use it as a phased array. You get a pretty nifty beam that can vaporize planets at a fairly long range, at least a few hundred light years. But it's also very obvious where it's coming from, because it's a freaking Dyson sphere. And anybody in the general direction would kind of notice that laser beam, etc. So they might want to shoot back at you, at which point it gets very silly, because Dyson spheres are pretty good at handling a big laser coming in. And for the laser to be dangerous over these distances, you need to focus it a lot, which means that it's very bad at destroying something big like a Dyson sphere, and it cannot hit objects that are moving around that you haven't seen recently, like the heroes on a spacecraft doing some dodging. Planets and space stations that don't change orbit every few years, they are in deep trouble. And that is an interesting aspect of how physics might determine some of the strategy.
In the three-body problem, he also is assuming that you can destroy things without revealing where you came from. Otherwise, there would be the second level of the game theory. you know, somebody reveals themselves, oh no, somebody might destroy them. But the question is, well, I don't want to destroy them because I might reveal where I'm from. Let somebody else destroy them, and then maybe nobody would destroy them.
So that also, yeah, sorry.
Anders, do you think the three-body problem is even sensible mathematically? Because would an object orbiting around 3 stars that way not be spun off into space immediately?
Yeah, generally the time until a planet moving in a really chaotic orbit ends up going off to infinity tends typically to be not very long. So it's not terribly plausible to have a really chaotic orbit for a planet long enough for life to develop and adapt and do anything interesting. You can certainly have chaotic orbits that are stable enough. They're kind of confined inside something known as calm toruses, Kolmogorov-Arnold-Moser toruses. So you can get various forms of confinement and still a fair bit of chaos that might create a very exciting planet. But it's not the extreme chaos that we see in the free body problem. So that is kind of annoying. I kind of like the free body problem as a metaphor for chaos and unpredictability, but that is very different from this idea that game theory and intelligent rational agents thinking about strategy will get a fairly deterministic outcome. I think in the real universe, one of the fun parts is that we have this mixture of random chaotic stuff and the rational agent trying to make sense of it. And up to a point, it's possible, but there's some stuff that you will have to kind of just keep on adapting to.
A different part of the three-body problem that we haven't commented on really stands out to me is the reverence. I'm going to call the word reverence that they have for physicists. Not only does the book have reverence for them, the characters do. And you can see that even more in the Chinese TV version of the series.
It's like a communist version of Ayn Rand. There's only like 100 people who are really important.
Who matter at all, right? And you know, as an economist, got to say, if you wanted to like destroy humanity's ability to resist the aliens, messing with these particle accelerators seems way down on the priority. I would know lots of ways to simply destroy the world economy with these little sophons if you could just smash things. Come on. But
yeah, I mean, it would also be possible to reprogram the main actors. Like they would be possible to change their mental states. If you can impose countdowns into their brains and induce suicide, you can probably also give them the knowledge and intention to destroy human civilization and act as the agents of the alien civilization. There would be many ways, but there might be dramaturgically, you know, as interesting and compelling for the audience.
Well, I mean, this is the way the book celebrates physicists, but not brain scientists. It assumes, well, they don't really know much brain science and they're not that interested. It's physics they really care about.
If you could screw with people's eyeballs, you could cause them to have a stroke. You could just kill them all immediately. So.
Yeah, so in many ways, a lot of the technology is kind of ridiculous. You're using the sophons to mess with physicists and particle accelerators, but it's able to cover the entire sky. So you could just cover Earth for 10 years, have all the humans starve to death and the planet go frozen. Right. And then it's a lovely beachfront property for the aliens once they arrive. So it's very much like these stories where aliens come from a distant star to steal our water, ignoring all the other planets and icy moons and things that have smaller gravity wells and is undefended, because it makes for a good story. But I do like Robin's point that the story really celebrates science and physics, and I think that is valuable on its own. We need to be able to celebrate more groups of people and more things. It's not just about criticizing them. Now, Joscha would probably say, yeah, maybe it should have been the AI research instead, because that's, of course, where the real threat to the aliens and maybe the humans are. Because the physicists, what's the likelihood of them totally transforming everything in a few centuries? Well, actually, given the track record, not terribly low, but still, we might believe that AI is more powerful for transforming things.
Well, the narrative was... the narrative includes the sophons being able to disrupt experiments around the world. I mean, they focus on particle colliders, of course, in the stories. But I guess you could assume that that's why the people didn't get to develop advanced artificial intelligence, because the sophons would just muck with it, right? So that's the way they kept AI off the stage.
But AI is a lot less concentrated than particle physics. There's hundreds of thousands of people who can do AI research, not just 5 accelerators.
Yeah. Have any of you seen Damien Wolter's critique of three-body problem? He's a science fiction critic. He focuses on the political messaging of the series, which is striking me more and more. I'm watching the Chinese version right now. but he calls it totalitarian utilitarianism. That the argument, if you put it in the context of the Chinese version of a century of humiliation, there's this hostile outside force. It has overwhelming surveillance and sabotage capabilities. And therefore, the only thing that we can do is protect ourselves with overwhelming surveillance capabilities as well. So in the Chinese version, they celebrate the Chinese state, rounding up all the scientists, using facial recognition, figuring out where everybody is. And it's like, yeah, if you were facing that threat, that's a rational response, but it's an argument for the totalitarian state.
Even in the Netflix version, there's this dramatic transition before, Earth doesn't realize there's a problem. And then there's a world commission in charge of it, and a person has complete discretion to run this whole battle for the rest of history. And we went like, what? How did that transition happen? Isn't there any debate over this? Was there anybody fighting over who would be in charge of this thing? It just doesn't happen at all. It's just, okay, this guy's in charge, and now boom, let's keep fighting.
In the Chinese version, it's a Chinese general who sits in a conference room that's a repurposed art museum. And there's the North American command and the African command and the South American command, and they all report in and they confer, and then they ask of this Chinese general, what do you think we should do? And he gives them commands about how to round up their scientists. Oh, you can't round up your scientists because of liberal democracy? We were able to round up ours in one day. It's so over the top as political propaganda.
But it also gets to an interesting question, and that is coordination. Right now, humanity, if we faced a joint threat, we would try to coordinate, and there would be a lot of meetings. But would we immediately put some general in charge? No, hardly. The process of even putting a single guy in charge, even if people were trying to do it properly, it would probably take a few years.
Decades.
And part of that is, of course, we need to build the institutions to do whatever is needed. Institutions are a kind of technology, and they're tricky to deal with. But there is also an interesting issue of what kind of coordination we want. We don't even agree on the kind of coordination. The Chinese Communist Party and Western Liberal Democrats have very different views on what kind of coordinations are good, and also how to share the planet with other coordinative systems. So
the solution to the coordination problem is to give unlimited authority to people who don't ever have to explain themselves and shouldn't ever explain themselves, right? They just have unlimited authority to do whatever they want.
And authority to one guy to pick those people.
Yeah, right.
In the 1940s, the US observed that there was a risk that Hitler would win World War II and take United Kingdom and so on. And later that there was a risk that the Soviet Union would end at the Atlantic. And this led to the US making a lot of decisions to enter very quickly into the war and get approval from Congress and from the general public, while not asking for the approval of the general public based on the same analysis that was done internally. And this was basically the modernist phase of the US, where there was an understanding that if you have an existential threat and you have a democracy that is permeable for manipulation of public opinion and so on, you need to use that opportunity rather than allowing your enemies to use it. And this is something that we no longer do in this developed postmodernist democracy that we have. But I don't think that is a natural law or something that shows clearly the success of democracy at solving our existential problems. I suspect that if we were faced again with an existential threat as a civilization, we would probably revert to a modernist mode as well. And COVID arguably was not that existential threat yet. We were not able to coordinate. I think that COVID could have been prevented in a way. We could have had a solution where you are installing breathalyzers at every airport and make sure that no respiratory disease is allowed on an airplane. And it could have been possible, but we are no longer able to achieve things at this level of threat. But I suspect if we were confronted with a serious existential threat and our government wouldn't cut it, somebody would move to deinstall that government and something else would emerge, and maybe the West would become authoritarian again. And arguably, Roosevelt was a pretty authoritarian government. Right? So I think it's really a function of the environment that we find ourselves to be in. In the current situation, we feel that we are too big to fail. So our government is mostly something that exists to make the critics of the government, the press, the public happy, and not to actually deal effectively with the ground truth.
War propaganda often presents them as unified and not facing the same sort of internal problems that we have. We focus on trying to get people to suppress their differences, to coordinate, because the threat of them, they've already handled that. And similarly with cultural changes. So in this novel, it's striking that we are internally presented at least having some coordination issues, and we also are presented as having cultural drift issues. That is, our culture changes substantially over time, which causes us a problem in having long-term plans and executing them. But they don't have these problems, and they don't really explain why. They just are unified, and they just keep their plans and culture going in a constant direction. And that's just constant with the history of these sorts of things. Generally, we assume the worst about the enemy, which is that they can coordinate and keep themselves on a path that we might not be able to.
The Trisolarans are a hive mind, aren't they? So,
well, what does that mean?
Yeah,
how does that keep them from drifting culturally? How does that keep them? How does that make them coordinate? Just
also, it's not completely
not an answer. It's a name.
Our Chinese protagonist gets a message back that warns her about responding. Right, so they have dissidents in their civilization as well.
That's true.
Yeah, I never understood that part.
Imagine that having an opposite side that is drifting and trying different things rather than being perfectly coordinated might be a worse outcome for humanity. Imagine getting attacked by civilization that has 100 nations using different methods. Some are trying propaganda, some are hacking, some are using weird physics weapons, some are using conventional low-tech weapons, etc., etc. That diversity might actually be somewhat tricky to deal with, but it makes for a very problematic story to tell. We generally also want to keep the enemy simple enough to understand. You might describe some main force and then say that there are various variations, but generally, even for the sake of a story, both propaganda internally, but also for fiction, we actually need some cohesion of other.
In the three-boundary problem, our cohesion is induced by this incredibly strategic bad choice on their part, which is just mind-bogglingly stupid. Even if they have trouble understanding lying, they should at least understand not saying things. They should be able to anticipate if they insult us all, like all at once worldwide, and call us all bugs or whatever, that we won't take kindly to that. Why do it? Or how are they not thinking through the consequence of that? Like, they're supposed to be, centuries, thousands of years long plans, a unified civilization, all working it out together, and they can't make the simplest PR judgment?
Robin, you've thought a lot about the relationship between intelligence and truth-telling. The implication of this is that the Trisolarans don't have the concept of deception and that they freak out when they find out about ours. What did you think about that?
It's just really hard to buy. Like, at the very minimum, they should know not to say things. You could never lie, but that doesn't mean you say everything you know. It's just really hard to imagine a civilization that's large where they wouldn't have different parts that have different perspectives and go in different directions. They wouldn't think about that. They wouldn't have some idea of how they could have different points of view and take that into account in their reasoning. That's just.
But maybe they are not very sophisticated. Maybe the way in which they create cohesion in their society is to establish so strong norms against not lying that they don't think outside of this box, or they don't have any official decision-making process that allows them to lie, and they don't need to, because they managed to be cohesive long enough to develop a new type of subatomic physics that is smarter than ours, and prevent us developing something that could compete with it. In a situation, they basically have the opportunity to get away with not being deceptive.
I think
it would be good to be deceptive on top of this, but they don't need to be.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is part of their biology, I think, which is described in one of the later books, is that they have an open mind. I mean, their skull is transparent, and they can see in each other's brains. And so just by hiding what you're thinking won't necessarily cut it, because
it's opacity
they
that's
can
the
see
issue,
what
not
you're
lying.
thinking. Yeah. Right.
They have complicated systems. They write complicated software. They have complicated minds. Even if nobody's lying, there definitely have to be some parts that are opaque to other parts. nothing is just simply transparent. It takes a lot of work to make things simply transparent, in the sense that every time you look at something, it's just obvious that you can understand it. It's easy to make sense of it. You know, the natural evolution is for things to just become complicated and hard to understand relative to each other. Even if nobody's lying, they'll have to think about what it means for things to be hard to understand and how to react to that. That's just a robust feature of large, complicated mental systems. It doesn't have to do about lying. It's about opacity. The idea that they could just all be transparent to each other, in that everything is just easy to understand, that never, even in a company where nobody ever lied to each other, still they wouldn't understand each other. That's just the nature of people.
But the existence of three Solarian defectors implies that individuals can be intransparent. But maybe this is not true for the collective agency of the civilization. When you have a collective concept, it's only real to the degree that you can get across, right? And so maybe you have norms, unlike in our society, where you don't do preference falsification for the public decision making, but instead you are completely honest and transparent for everything that is shared across the civilization. Right? It's in our civilization, we systematically lie about things that we believe not all parts of the public will understand and agree with. So our government always has to have a mode about its decision making. Our companies have modes around their decision making, and everything becomes somewhat transparent because there's only partial collaboration. But imagine that you enforce a society that has total collaboration with respect to collective agency. And I'm just spitballing here. I'm not saying this is a good solution and so on, and I fundamentally disagree with you, Robin. But I think it's conceivable that you can construct such a thing.
Merely requiring that nothing be hidden is far from sufficient to produce mutual understanding. That's the point. Things can just be opaque, not because people are hiding something, because that's just the natural way things evolve. It's hard to understand each other, even yourself.
Yes, well, just imagine we developed an artificial intelligence that was an interpretability layer across everybody's thoughts, such that everybody's thoughts became naturally interpretable or understandable by every other agent in the game. And if you couldn't understand it yourself, then you'd have your AI agent or your AI symbiont or your digital twin do the interpreting and explain it to you in the way that you'd understand. Right.
But there is a scaling problem here. So is it just understanding the person you're talking to? Well, a lot of the things they are referring to may only make sense in context based on other people. And if you want to actually have your symbiote explain what everybody is thinking, now the poor symbiote needs to summarize the entire cognitive state of the entire civilization and get that into cohesive mode. Now, if the civilization was just that symbiote, that might actually explain a lot of things. Then you have a little bit of people running around, but it's actually the story about the very well-coordinated symbiote that is keeping the common knowledge going. But I think computationally, this is not very useful. It's going to be very costly. There's a reason why companies don't have everybody tell everybody what's going on, because you don't need that information. And spending time receiving that information is going to take up your conscious bandwidth too much. And I think the same thing is true for any form of system, biological or artificial.
It's going to be inevitable. Hierarchy of informational control.
And you also want to handle uncertainty. It's not just things that are secret or that people are lying. There are things that we just don't know for certain. The sensor haven't gotten enough photons from a remote planet, so we're not entirely certain about its properties. Over time, that uncertainty is going to go down. But that means that there is a lot of information that have varying levels of uncertainty. So even a civilization that for some reason didn't have a concept of lying would soon realize that, oh, we are receiving uncertain information from the aliens. We don't quite understand them. So some of this might have multiple interpretation. And then it's pretty natural to do the game theory and realize, oh, we could actually send deliberately uncertain information and we will get these strategic advantages. Hey, let's do that.
Here's a solution that would explain why the aliens are behaving the way they do. They had the Baudelaire jihad that prevented their transition to AGI, so they could retain their aesthetics. And as an outcome of this, they installed some kind of monarchy, some kind of absolute dictatorship, and the dictator is not always super smart. He's just good enough. And
so the presentation is that the moment he says, "You are bugs," he's just reacting emotionally to what he's heard from us. He's throwing it at us and having no filter of, should he say this to us? Is this the sort of
but he
thing
can afford to.
There's just
because he's invincible.
Reaction from, it's the
If you are
simplest
invincible, you get
childish
away
reaction.
with this. If you can get away with this, if nobody can get at you. And he has mathematically proven to himself that because we have not achieved this level where we can get back at him, and he's invincible to us, he can just do it. And there is no reason for the government to be smarter than it is.
So in, say, Star Wars, there's lots of implausible physics. You could, and people do try to make up stories. Oh, this looks implausible. What if you do this way? But most people go, no, that they're just making up crappy physics, right? But I feel like you can do the same with social science too, right? You could say, social science would probably say the following thing. You say, oh, but let's make some other assumptions. I think we have to admit that this author tried harder to get the physics right than he did to get the social science right, which is fine. You can't be an expert in everything.
I'm biting back a comment about Age of M, but all right.
I tried to get the social science and the physics right in Age of M.
But it is an interesting challenge, actually, to try to, for example, get the economics right. I've been playing around with my hobby role-playing games, and getting economics to work in Dungeons & Dragons, everybody agrees it's absolutely impossible. You need to make stuff up and then get the players to realize what they're not supposed to look too carefully about. So recently I've been looking at magical industrial revolutions, and I'm going to now tell my players what we should be thinking about and what they should please don't think about, because otherwise nothing makes sense.
I do like the idea that's implicit in the three-body video game and history of their civilization, that the accumulation of knowledge over time, even though they go through successive catastrophes, the accumulation eventually leads to a technological civilization. And it reminded me a lot of the kind of catastrophic risk stuff and catastrophic risk mitigation stuff that we've been talking about for a while. But how you make sure, especially in this scenario where they can be eaten or burned as firewood when they're in their dehydrated state, where exactly is this knowledge being preserved, if it's not in the heads of these dehydrated husks?
But it is a throwback to the early world of science fiction, where people's identity is supposed to be wrapped up in all these science tech things we're learning, and then our other cultural differences are seen as less important. And so, the Trisolarans are of that form of the traditional science fiction culture, and science fiction in the last few decades has rejected that. That is, it's basically said, no, these other cultural differences are more important than the technology we accumulate between us. And if I disagree with you enough on that, you're not me, and I reject you and I fight you. So three-body problem is throwing back, because it's also trying to do that for the humans. It's also showing an obstacle to it and how it might fail, but it's basically trying to get the humans to say, the fact that you guys accumulate the science and technology, that should be the core of your identity, and that should unite you, and these other things should be set aside.
Yeah, the fact that humans have a cumulative culture is a very striking fact. When writing in my Grand Futures book, that is kind of one of the big points in the early chapter about how did we end up here. And yeah, we're intelligent, but that is not as telling as we accumulate a cumulative culture. Even if we were less smart, we would probably still be a pretty dangerous species by building up a cumulative culture. We have not just collective intelligence that we communicate in our group. We're also getting communication from the past, and we're ratcheting up this in a very strong way.
And classic science fiction invites you to identify with your descendants in that cumulative culture sense, whatever other cultural differences they might have. And that's the key thing that lately people can't choke on and they can't swallow. Nope, I'm not going to accept what these descendants are like, even if they share my accumulated science and technology, because I have these culture things I care a lot about, and they better toe the line on that or the hell with them.
2 years back, I read an interesting interview with Leo Cixin, where he was asked about his position about liberalism and the Chinese government, and to the consternation of the interviewer, he was unwilling to renounce the Chinese government and the order of Chinese society, which makes sense on all sorts of levels, regardless of what his opinions are. But if we take a step back and see that China has a different idea on how a society should be run than the West currently does, and we take this more or less as a playbook, if we take the this entire structure of world building, and also the sociology of the aliens and their morality as something that is more logical to him. What would this look like? Will we see that important AI researchers will soon commit suicide because the LLMs are doing very weird things, whereas the Chinese LLMs seem to be working, but we don't hear a lot about them anymore?
I think there is also a lot of interesting sociological assumptions stories do about how science works. So one category of science fiction stories you find in the early modernist era is, of course, the genius. You have a lone inventor who comes up with an invention, and it's very individual-centric. Partially, of course, because it's coming very much from American science fiction. Then later on, you get the scientific teamwork stories where it's actually recognized that actually you need a bit of diverse opinions, and actually discourse between them can be quite powerful too. But there is, again, quite often this practical assumption that, well, it's kind of a power law. It's only a few scientists that really matter for producing the really big things that we want to tell our stories about. Telling a science story about a myriad of researchers, many of which are writing really low citation papers, but adding a few data points, it's not that fun. You can do it. There is some interesting stories to be told there, but that's a very different kind of story. But even the idea of what the scientific process is like is something that quite often is not told in science fiction, because we're more interested in the output. Even the mad scientists are actually mad engineers. Very few of them are trying to test something when they build a giant space laser. They actually want to demonstrate to the world something which is typical an engineering issue. Actually, seeing real science happen is surprisingly rare, and it's quite often delightful when you see something like the Vroma Strain by Crichton, which actually has a pretty good description of an attempt at figuring out a scientific problem.
You know, in the Chinese version, they focus on a theme that I think is in the novels, if I remember correctly. There's this International Federation of Scientists, and basically it casts suspicion on the idea of an international association of scientists, that they would be getting up to crazy, nefarious schemes that none of the rest of us could understand based on, you know, their bizarre belief systems. And the lists of this organization are what's used to round up scientists in the story. And I found that very troubling theme, you know, because they took that out of the Netflix version, that you were going to, you know, demonize international scientific cooperation.
The villain, the biggest villain in the story, is this lone scientist, right? So there is the moral story there of this one lone scientist with her own independent moral judgment, acting on her own, you know, bringing Earth to ruin.
Yeah. Which, you know, I'm sure you're aware of the controversy that her father being killed in the Cultural Revolution is the centerpiece and the motivating thing, the first scene of the entire Netflix series, and they took that out of the Chinese version. It's barely even acknowledged that she was a victim of the Cultural Revolution.
And it's a criticism of high moral standards, because in essence, high moral standards is exactly what makes her throw in her weight with the trisolarans. He says, they couldn't be as bad as this. Obviously, we're just terrible moral here. And if the book's message is, no, they could be much worse than this. Like, stop demanding such high moral standards from Earth people, like bind together as Earth people, even if you have moral disagreements, is his main message.
But the core message, I think, is slightly deeper. It's you can only expect collaboration on behalf of the human species by people who believe that the human species doesn't suck. And there are people who have legitimate reasons to disagree.
Anders talked about grounding science and grounding engineering. Can we ground values, ethics, and even culture in a sort of real way? How many of you lean towards moral realism or some permutation of that? Yep. Okay, we have Anders. James?
No.
No?
No.
Joscha?
I'm an existentialist.
I think that we lost a little bit our way in terms of defining morality in our society. For over 1,000 years, the source of morality was divine will. And after we lost the concept of God in the mainstream of our society, we tried to come up with alternatives. And I think that utilitarianism is an unfinished project that was attempted by a generation of philosophers, and they didn't manage to get it to work. And later generations of philosophers thought that they were onto something, and then write about these people who started writing about this, but they also didn't get it to work. And so I don't think that we at the moment have a morality that we could implement in an AI, because it would make logical sense and could be derived from axioms or based on formed into outcomes that give us testable ideas of morality. And the original concept of divine will is, I suspect, something that is underestimated, right? If you define God not as a supernatural being that is creating physical universes and has no epistemological basis, but as the best collective agent that can be enacted by agents who decide to act coherently, then we can think from this perspective, or the best possible agent that we can be part of, what should be done. And that leads to a possibility to discuss a morality that is also compatible with the notion that Robin and James have mentioned. How can we get humanity to collaborate? What is the direction in which we should collaborate? And it is when we are forming an agency together with each other and together with possibly also other species, what is the best possible thing that could be done under such a system in which it's harmonic, and then we can try to come up with criteria of discourse to determine how that collaborative agent should define itself.
So the funny thing here is that I'm not terribly far away from Joscha, although I would call myself a moral realist. But I'm a very wussy moral realist. Surprise, surprise, being a rather wussy person, according to most ideologies, being very Scandinavian about it. I think in general, there are some patterns that just happen because of game theory and symmetries of reality that mean that certain behaviors have certain consequences. And then you get some patterns that are self-consistent, and they are going to work out much better than others. Now, for a particular kind of creature like humans, we create social structures and normative structures, and there is both a kind of evolutionary competition between them. Some ways of organizing society collapse rather rapidly and get replaced with others. Some are fairly effective and get copied by other observers. But there are also some patterns that have natural dynamics to them. For example, a few years back, I had a paper where I looked at what happens if agents are able to change their social value orientation. So they can literally decide whether they care about others or not. So they can move around in the social value space. And the prediction my co-author and me had from the start was, oh, they're all going to become a kind of a sociopathic individualists. It didn't happen. They turned more or less pro-social. They cared about their own payoff in various games and in the payoff of the other part. And this was not because of niceness. Eventually we realized it's just a symmetry argument. If I'm trying to make sure my score is high and your score is high, you have the same goals as I do if I'm playing with somebody else who's pro-social. If I'm an individualist who wants to maximize my score and don't care about your score, and you're an individualist, we are having kind of opposed views, so we are getting into a more complicated situation. It turns out that it's easier to satisfy things if you're pro-social. So in this case, symmetry worked out rather nicely, and you got a nice result. And I think the same thing is true for some aspects of morality. Now, the problem might be that if you're a radically different kind of agent, some important aspects might become very different. For example, the fact that humans currently, if we die permanently, and it's very hard to come back from that. That is linked to the kind of organism we are. But if we were software with easy backups, killing other entities to make a point in a discussion might actually be just seen as, okay, slightly rude. But it doesn't have that moral importance. You do change it a lot. And this, of course, means that if you're dealing with aliens that are fundamentally different, now you might have an interesting moral problem. But it's also pretty likely that the space of possible consistent morality can be pretty large. I don't know if this turns out to be uncountably large, or that there are actually 17 consistent moralities possible in this universe, and every civilization eventually ends up adhering to one of them.
I'd say that what we know about human cultural evolution suggests there are a great many different possible equilibrium of culture. Certainly what we know about biological evolution is that there can be enormous biological variety in a world of strong biological selection, and culture seems to be similar. So, I mean, not everything would be selectable. That is, not all possible organisms exist in biology. Yeah, so there's definitely some constraints, but there's huge variety of organisms in biology, and I think there'll be a huge variety of cultures that are consistent not only with humans, but AIs, et cetera, in the future. So within the variety of cultures, of the ones that survive the selection process, I don't see a basis for choosing. That's the sense in which I would be a relativist and not a realist. I mean, there might be one of the cultures has it right and they've got moral truth, but I don't see how it wins against the others. The other cultures could just coexist and do fine as well.
Just in terms of xenobiological speculation and this cosmic sociology question, I've never been very impressed with people who try to make generalizations about the kinds of cultures that we would encounter. You're one of them, Robin. Your expansionary thesis, I guess, is a version of. I guess it's not a.
What's a selection effect?
Yeah.
I might say there are some selection effects, and we can predict the consequences of them. But there's a lot of cultures consistent with those selection effects. So yes, I think selection for expansion is likely over long time scales.
Yeah, but the idea that they would be inevitably aggressive or inevitably cooperative or something like that.
The ones that are selected will be more so.
Right.
Again, it's not an inevitability. I mean, obviously there's enormous variety, but if you're looking for tendencies, then.
Well, but you're arguing then that cooperation wouldn't be selected for.
Cooperation within the expansionary groups would be selected for, right?
Okay, so if we're riding around with existentially catastrophic weapons and we're not a cooperative society, we may converge on extinction.
Because cooperation is not an unconditional thing. So, intelligent cooperation strategies are quite conditional. They are about cooperating with these groups in these situations and not those and that. That's what real successful cooperation is about. There is no generic cooperation or generic aggression. Those don't make sense.
Indeed, in the first serious attempt at doing some kind of astrosociology, that is Carl Sagan and Shklovsky, they were writing in the 60s and first bringing up the issue of existential risk as an answer to the Fermi paradox. And of course, during the Cold War, this was a very natural thing to do. Their argument was very much like there might be a lot of civilization coming into being, and then they get very strongly selected against if they can't handle the nuclear weapons. The few that survive, they are presumably good at cooperating. They were very optimistic about them being nice. But I think that might have been a bit premature. But it was an interesting argument that you get these selection bottlenecks that generate particular kinds of civilizations that then might do other things. So in the Sagan model, it might be that then they might become quite civilizations or grabby ones, but they're still very likely to be cooperators because they have managed to handle dangerous weapons of mass destruction.
Certainly over the last few centuries, we've seen enormous selection on Earth for ability to cooperate. Industrial economy is all based on the ability to manage large organizations and to make them work. Enormous abilities to cooperate. Of course, markets are a form of cooperation. We don't have massive war all over the world, which means we have sufficient military cooperation to prevent massive war. So we are a planet of a lot of cooperation, clearly, and we've had a lot of selection for cooperation of certain sorts. That doesn't mean we're all nice to each other, and it would be nice to any alien who showed up.
I think it might be interesting to take a software-centric perspective rather than a civilization or individual-centric perspective. I'm basically a software that is possessing a region of the physical universe to some degree. And what I identify myself as is not something that is God-given, but it's a story that this agent tells itself about what it is and what it performs as. And what determines my success ultimately in an evolutionary game is whether the structure that I impose by controlling the region of the universe that I can affect is sustainable and whether I can defend it against competition. And in this way, there are different strategies. What Anders describes is if I maximize not only my score, but also your score and so on, we can get to an agreement that despite being transactional is leading to something that looks somewhat collaborative and altruistic. I suspect that if you are identifying as part of a system that is more important than yourself, you switch from the single-celled mode to a multicellular mode to a state-building mode. And humanity is, by and large, a state-building species, even though not every individual is. Right? We do have sociopathic individuals that are unable to identify with the goals of groups or civilization itself, but we have a lot of people which find it very natural, based on their priors, to identify with group-level goals or planet-level goals or idea-level goals. And all these identifications are in evolutionary competition and lead to the emergence of different moralities. And I'm also a moral realist in the sense that not every morality is going to be supportive to your survival, and ultimately evolution is going to win.
But when it wins, variety might win as the win.
It might,
right?
But unless
That's
you have
what's
an
our
optimum.
experience so far in cultures and in biology is variety is what wins, not any one particular thing.
Yes, it's also because we are very far from some kind of provable optimum in settling the planet. Right? Evolution has not converged to some kind of stable optimum. Instead, you have trajectories that are competing branches that grow, wither, and die. And so far, that's always continued like this. But imagine that we have a phase transition where life gets dramatically more compute and can indeed have provable optima of the organization of matter in a region of space. In that case, you might end up with singletons.
Or lots of copies of optimal organisms. I've been having a long-running argument with a friend about the design of self-replicating von Neumann probes. And I generally think that I can make a general one. It's not going to replicate as rapidly as a specialized one for that particular solar system, but it's good enough for most solar systems. So if I were to build that and send it off, it could get most of the resource of the universe. And my friend is arguing, no, you need to optimize it for each solar system, and it's actually a complex problem. And then we have ended up with a big argument about the asteroid types and what the spectra of other exoplanets are. So we're getting into a lot of interesting technical weeds, but the real issue is, of course, the state space that you're trying to act in. How complex is it? Do you know that from the start? Can you prove optima? For many systems, we know that we can't prove optima particularly well because they're too computationally complex. And then usually we get the rejoinder from some other computational complexity theories. Yeah, but we can approximate it within 0.5% polynomial time. So the remaining 0.5% might not matter that much.
But the whole idea of optimal small things assumes that these small things are independent of each other. Once the small things are a part of a larger social world, then what matters is how they coordinate in that social world. What optimum is dependent on the culture they're in. And so then you have to talk about an optimal culture, but now you're talking about an optimal everything, which seems probably infeasible to calculate.
Also because you quite often develop your culture or evolution by adding new dimensions. You might do an evolutionary transition by taking prokaryotes and having them move together into eukaryotes. You get various new ecological niches when organisms find out the interest of it. And people figure out new ways of running stuff or new technologies that change the precondition. And these ones seem to so far make it extremely hard to do this optimization. Now, a lot of it depends on whether there is an upper limit to technology. So there are these 3 long bets that Peter Eckersley, me and Toby Ord and others have been struggling to turn into a proper paper. It began when Peter Eckersley and Toby had a bet that by the time we meet aliens, we would have reached a technological saturation. We would essentially have reached the limits of what is possible technologically speaking. Now, the interesting part here is that it's very unclear which side of the bet to take, actually. There are good arguments for both sides. It could be that technology is essentially open-ended. In some technical sense, it is, but that's kind of trivial one. Or it could be that, well, the laws of physics only allow certain things. But there are also interesting things about science. We have another bet about, well, by the point we have spread far enough, is science going to have stopped discovering new things beyond things like more mathematical theorems and collecting more interesting organisms from biospheres? And the third bet in this collection was actually, by the time humanity is starting to become causally disconnected in its expansion across the universe, are we still in disagreement about what morality is? Might it be that we have very different systems? Now, sadly, Peter passed away before we had a chance to formalize this bet. So we have his unfinished paper, and but we were planning to kind of try to put it to the Long Now Foundation's long bet collection, except that they're actually too long term for them. They want a finite point in time when you're supposed to be unraveling it, not when we meet our first alien civilization, which might be indefinitely far in the future.
On that question of like what you ally with, what you identify with, three-body problem at some point allows the possibility that some Earth people might ally with some Trisolarians and have a different axis on which they are disagreeing. And then
naive collaborators.
Go ahead.
Naive collaborators.
Right, but the book is disapproving of that, saying, oh, you're just being fooled. Like the book is claiming, oh, the fundamental difference here is Earth versus Trisolarians, and any other dimension on which you might try to focus, that would just be somebody trying to trick you into losing the Earth versus Trisolarian war, right? But we can wonder ourselves, if we were to meet aliens, could we find, each of us find some part of the aliens that we had more in common with, in some sense, than the other people from our civilization, and then other divisions might come to the fore. I think that's a completely reasonable thing to ask about when our descendants meet aliens, is to what extent will us versus them be the main thing in our minds, or will we find common causes with part of them? Like certainly when we think about different nations on the earth today, most of us now are less tied to our nation than we are to some other particular group in another nation that shares our profession or shares our scientific interests or artistic interests, things like that. And so we are realigning our allegiances in the world today not to be focused mainly on nations. And that seems not a crazy thing to expect for the future of us versus aliens, or just for the future in general. That is, I don't think we should know exactly what's going to be the main alliances. What are the main axes of disagreement? We, often these Earth versus aliens things assume obviously that this would be that, but most war stories assume the nation difference are the major thing, and nobody else really cares about class or profession or gender or age or things. But honestly, we can easily care about those things more than we care about nation.
One of the things I loved about Babylon 5 back in the 90s, I don't know if any of you saw it, but in Babylon 5, there's this international coalition of species interstellar. And on Earth gets taken over by a fascist human supremacist government. And this international pan-species coalition has to invade Earth in order to restore democracy, liberal democracy to the universe, which I just love that idea that Earth had to be invaded in order to restore democracy.
Yeah, fascinating. I think you put up in a question time in one of Anders' Foresight talks, which I listened to recently, actually. Yeah, it's quite interesting. Have you got a response to that? The fault lines wouldn't necessarily be between alien species or between us as the humans and the aliens, but more along ideological commitments or aesthetic commitments that it may be shared more closely. Like I may share some aesthetic with an alien from the opposite side of the border there, and then start trading and collaborating with them instead of just being all human supremacists, right? For instance.
I think that is likely for many civilizations, but the question is what dimensions of these fault lines might be. I haven't seen it, but I bet that there must be at least a few Soviet-era science fiction stories where it's essentially about the heroic communists meeting the oppressed workers of alien species and helping them incite a revolution, while the capitalists from America probably trying to help the leaders of aliens, or vice versa. It must exist. But I think a more plausible fault line, at least from a grand future perspective, is what to do about the resources across time and space. So I have argued that it might be rational to, if you're a kind of computationally obsessed civilization, you want to wait with using your resources until very late. So you want to essentially sleep in, because it's hot and sweltering right now, until after the stars have burned out and the background radiation is at a nice 10 to the minus 30 Kelvin. And that's when the good times really can start rolling. Now you're essentially 10 to the 30 times richer in terms of resources. You just need to make sure nobody gobbles up those resources while you're asleep. And you can imagine other people and civilizations say, actually, this resource would come in very, very handy. Why should those sleepy people get so much of a universe? They can, if we take 90%, we still got 10 to the 29 amount of original resources. Here is one interesting conflict that's basically set by the concept of time and what you care about. You can easily imagine also, depending on different value systems, that if you expand over large cosmological distances, you have problems keeping together causally because the galaxy clusters drift apart. Now, if you have an aggregative consequentialist view like hedonism, you might say, I'm going to spread happy mind states across all systems that can house it. And it doesn't matter that they cannot communicate because the galaxy clusters move apart. You basically end up with trying to spread happiness across a large volume. But if you take a view that actually being causally connected is important because maybe you have a more eudaimonic idea of happiness, or for that matter, any other system that actually wants to have a big civilization that lasts for a long time as one civilization, you don't want to expand too much. And you might want to make a deal with an aggregationist and he's saying, you get all the other galaxy clusters, but we keep the center, the core. And then, of course, you might indeed have others saying, we want to preserve the historically important planet Earth in that galaxy for as long as possible. Now, you have dealings here that look very different. And I can imagine if you meet aliens, they might both have these big general same views. It might be that the Zorgons and the humans, when we meet, the hedonistic utilitarians on both sides are just going off to generate as much happiness, while the people who are more eudaimonic on both sides, they don't understand each other, they don't like each other's virtues, but both of them agree that we're going to keep our core clusters here. So you can kind of see that some of these very fundamental things could indeed cause interesting splits. In this case, also nice based on physics and ethics, which is good for a paper, because it's much harder to talk about aesthetics. It might be that some of the alien arts or alien activities are really appealing, but we can't tell what they are until we see them, and vice versa, of course, for the aliens.
Anders, if you want to preserve Earth, at some point you will have to explain how this is going to minimize free energy.
Why should you minimize free energy?
Because those who do tend to survive.
All else equal.
Yes.
But all else need not be equal.
That's true. It might be possible that you can create some kind of bottleneck, that you basically, like CDS, just work at scale. That you could be some big dump AGI that is locking in a present state that is suboptimal, right? To prevent us from revolutionizing subatomic physics and build much better subparticle physics. So we could harvest much more free energy, we could have much more consciousness and interesting stuff in the universe. But no, you want to preserve Earth, so you're going to go after us and destroy us.
So
but that is a difficult argument to make ethically.
It's important because there is one obvious form of value lock-in that you can get, and that's existential risk. If we're all dead, we have the same kind of null value. But I think we can envision various forms of lock-in as dictatorship or AI nannies or other things. And that is worrisome because historically we have reason to think that it would not have been good for us if our values got locked in by the Romans or some medieval monks. But at the same time, there are maybe scary values we want to safeguard against. So that creates an interesting problem. And this might be one of those issues where people have different views. However, I would also argue that evolution and the universe is pretty sloppy. There are many things that are not optimal, but remain for a shockingly long time. So just because something doesn't maximize free energy doesn't mean it's not occurring.
Yeah, there is a kind of safety is to say evolution was pretty good because it led to me, but I wanted to stop here. It should never be anything that's better than me. And let's do everything to prevent the emergence of anything that could replace me.
I've spent a lot of time in the last month or so thinking about cultural evolution, and I realized all the AI people talking about value lock-in are, in denial about the fact that cultural evolution just does not lock in values at all. It just changes values wholesale and hugely over small timescales. That is tradition on Earth. We are not at all the sort of species that locks in values. We rapidly change our values in response to pretty random cultural processes.
But arguably, most of these people don't think about values, they're pattern matchers. And they see value distribution as some kind of social pattern matching.
name you want to give it. We don't have like stable deep values as a human species. We have whatever values our culture has, and that can't be anything, but it's a wide range of things, and we don't lock those down. They just change.
A lot of this.
Your comment earlier, Anders, about communist aliens in the communist imaginary, I just want to put on the table that there was a Trotskyist mini movement in the 1950s and 60s, led by a guy named Posadas, and they believed that kind of like the Mormon transhumanist theory, that intelligence would naturally evolve in a cooperative and peaceful direction. That would necessarily be socialist. Therefore, alien species that are smarter than us would necessarily be socialist. So all we have to do is contact them and bring their benefits to us. And I wonder, I mean, Maoism and Trotskyism are opposite ends of the communist spectrum, but I wonder if he knew about that at all.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Also, it's worth noting that the Posadists were even saying that, yeah, nuclear war is very likely. Yay, that's going to destroy capitalism. There is even this idea that certain disasters might actually help having the aliens come here and develop things. So there is also this idea that disruptions might be very powerful.
They notice this because of Hiroshima.
And I think that is actually something some city researchers have also been taking surprisingly seriously, that maybe we can look for remote nuclear wars. What are the signs that a planet has had a nuclear war in terms of radiation, isotopes in the atmosphere? Because it might be a kind of techno-signature. It has never been a particularly popular thing to look for, because most of the SETI researchers tend to be optimists and don't really want to think about these gloomy possibilities. But it is an interesting case.
I think there's a fundamental conflict here between trying to set stories on cosmological timescales and space scales, and having those stories be tied to cultural divisions that are only a century or so old on Earth. Like, you got to figure that culture will change, and our current divisions won't be that sensible to people a century or two from now, because the things we're talking about are only pretty recent. But that makes it hard to sort of identify with these future versions of ourselves, or the alien versions, who just have very different whole maps of the interesting issues.
So one interesting argument Karim Jabari had in a paper was that if you look at the anthropological data from hunter-gatherer cultures, there's certainly a lot of cultural diversity between different groups, but a lot of their life is actually fairly similar, because they're strongly constrained by the material circumstances of being hunter-gatherer. Once you become agricultural, Bronze Age culture, the range becomes bigger because you have more resources, but you're still likely to build stuff like pyramid-like things. Not necessarily pyramids, but that kind of thing shows up again. The range of the culture gets wider, but it's still much smaller. Once you get to Iron Age, the range gets much bigger. And presumably we could have all sorts of very different cultures with an industrial or post-industrial civilization. And part of that is probably the lack of constraints. So Robin, you have had that very interesting argument about the dream time, that right now we're out of this Malthusian trap. So we can create all sorts of crazy ideas and views of the world. And that might end if things turn Malthusian again. And then this is a very weird, brief flowering. But it could be, of course, if my more optimistic take, that we can actually rein in the Malthusian impulse and just have post-scarcity until the end of the universe. In that case, we should actually expect even more crazy stuff over vaster and vaster ranges of time and space.
Right. But I mean, like, you'd have to put some constraint about how this massive amount of resources were used in such a way. You'd have to say, okay, we can't really weaponize it if we want to maintain a cohesive society, unless everybody is morally uplifted, right? Such that they find it impossible.
Property rights, access rights. There's a lot of ways of coordinating about resource use, and some of them centralized, some of them decentralized. The real problem might be that if you have some entity that thinks, I'm just going to make as many copies of myself as possible, how do you prevent that entity from overrunning the system? that at its simplest, it's probably not very hard to deal with that crazy guy, but there are probably more complex counterparts, and you need the adaptation to handle that. I remember having a discussion with Robin years ago about the amount of theft physics allows in the long term. Because if I want to store up a lot of resources for the next trillion years, and somebody's stealing those resources, I might not have very much after a trillion years. So the question is, how much can I protect a trillion year of resources?
So when somebody is copying themselves, it means they might reduce complexity. If you have managed to get one model of their defenses that has chinks in their armor, exposes them to you, then you will find the same chink in their armor in their copies. It's pretty likely that for some reason you don't get gray goo for the same reason that you don't get green goo.
I completely agree with Anders that the one most important question about the future, overwhelming all of us, is how much will competition dominate the results versus some form of coordination that then can limit competition and allow a wider range of other things. That is the biggest question. And it's still pretty open, I'd say. But I think under the scenario where competition dominates, it's easier to analyze and predict what happens there. In the scenario where competition doesn't dominate, there's just a much wider range of possibilities, and I find it hard to even analyze. I just finished Bostrom's book, Deep Utopia, where he heroically tries to do that, but it feels like in a limited range of cultures, he's figuring out what they might want to do in this deep utopia, but I don't think he has a clue about what hundreds of thousands of other cultures might want to do there, because it's just so impossible to constrain that, really.
Our way of framing that problem is whether you end up as a singleton in the end, or whether you're going to have coordination between competing entities and collaborating entities. And I remember when we were in Panama, Anders gave a panel on trying to prove limits of planned economy, which can be possibly translated into an attempt to prove that a singleton might not be optimal.
Yeah, I think generally asking for a singleton that is perfect, that's not possible at all. The question is how much of an imperfect singleton can you accept? Basically, if you want to run the world, you need a system that can model the world essentially one-to-one. So that needs to be bigger than the world. So either you accept that Earth is surrounded by this vast infrastructure of something running it and controlling it, or it's going to simplify the world and people and processes inside it so they're simple enough to control, which sounds really bad, or it has some error probability. And I think that is, of course, the more likely thing. What is an acceptable error probability? How to characterize this? I think that it's a very interesting scaling issue. And some of it, I think, is amenable to rigorous study. I just think we're at very early stages. And this is where maybe astrosociology might make sense. There is, for example, that interesting paper about OD scaling by Alan Defoe and others, arguing that in some systems, as the amount of resources go up for both sides, you end up with a defense dominant situation. That would be lovely if that's true. I don't know if I trust it to be true for many systems in physics. It seems to be true on some scales in the universe, but maybe not for all. That needs way more analysis. I think this might actually determine what options we do have long term.
The three-body problem definitely puts our attention on the competitive scenario, just to mention, bring it back to what we were initial topic here, right? It's pulling attention to that, and so presumably more people will think about that as a result.
I suspect that from the projected outcome, it's not so much competitive, right? There seems to be a trend towards a singleton in the universe. If you manage to get ahead of your competition in forging technology that lets you absolutely dominate the landscape, then you'll end up as a singleton. But it might be more interesting to systematically think about the condition under which a singleton prevails. I've been able to defend the singleton nature of my own mind. Basically, I'm the only thing that allowed to run on my brain. And there might be people which don't do this. Right? There are people which do have multiple personalities. It might be possible that split-brain people do not maintain a single integrated consciousness, but have two. And there are conditions under which country will split up into having multiple governments and not having a singleton government. And there are other conditions where we get to a singleton government. And an obvious condition is probably the ability to defend the structure that you're controlling against the emergence of competition. And that's, one is the emergence, and the other one is what if outside competition already exists, under which conditions are you able to protect your territory?
A lot of battlegrounds of competition claim to be unified and be a singleton. So like most companies, for example, have enormous internal conflicts, but they present themselves to the world as a unified thing. So just because your mind is telling you unified, don't believe it necessarily.
Right.
Yes.
The history of the socialist
Real
debate
legion.
about this argues that you can have the commanding heights, but allow market competition at lower levels. I think that's the answer I would have given to Ender's talk at the conference, is that socialists, if they think that they can plan everything, they were wrong, but most socialists don't even want to plan everything anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting even to see the people in socialism that still think that planning is possible. Their arguments are basically making certain simplifying computational assumptions, which I think actually are not as innocuous as they look. Most reasonable socialists realize, okay, actually, market seems to be doing something useful. And then they realize that Herbert Simon saw the light in his 93 paper that observed that most of the market is actually taken up by organizations that are not really markets internally. They're organized in various ways. They're maybe not planned economies, but they're certainly not free markets. Walmart is very much closer to the Soviet Union than the stock exchange.
Right.
I'm just wondering how many of you think that it's likely that any civilization that gains the technology to be expansionist or have some sort of presence on the cosmic scale first goes through an intelligence explosion in some way. That is, develops, something akin to artificial intelligence, and then after that, if they get it correct, if it doesn't destroy them or turn their local region into paperclips, then they can have the technology to build Dyson spheres and galactic megastructures and a cosmic presence.
Even if it makes paperclips, it'll still end up being a big visible thing on the cosmic scale. I think those are local
Yes, true.
civilization issues. They don't
Yeah.
affect.
But just a bunch of paperclips won't be a civilization. Is my point.
Well, it's a very boring civilization. In some sense, the Fermi paradox, the great silence, is kind of evidence that we don't get the most expansive forms of AI disasters in the universe, or we're alone. So
we're really early, Robbins pointed out, right? Very early in the timeline of the cosmos, at least the stelliferous era.
We're early relative to when life like us would appear if everything would just sit and wait for us. But the claim is that it's not sitting and waiting for us. Right now, half the volume of the universe is already taken. And so we're roughly in the middle of that distribution.
Yeah, and I do think that the intelligence explosion issue is interesting because it's in some sense a separate issue from spreading across the universe. Spreading across the universe is a matter of transmitting information and a sufficiently big toolkit that can self-replicate over long distances. This doesn't necessarily require a lot of intelligence. It requires some other physics. It probably requires miniaturization to be doable. There is some kind of frontier between moving fast and moving large masses. On the other hand, in order to do big stuff, typically you want self-replicating technology to scale things up, to build very big things. Once you have the big things, you can use them to make other big things. So for making a Dyson sphere, I would go for self-replicating robots powered by solar power, etc. And you can work out a lot of details, but you don't necessarily need that much smarts. I don't think you need anything that's much smarter than a dog or anything like that. You essentially just need the robots to have the right behavior to pick apart asteroids and launch stuff into the right spot. Now, it would be great to have overseer systems that are slightly smarter, like a chimp, and maybe some people running this show. And of course, a superintelligence might come up with something much smarter than a Dyson sphere. Dyson spheres are probably not the optimal way of handling these problems. But intelligence explosion seems to be a different axis. That is kind of optimizing your optimization power, optimizing your computational ability and flexibility. And that might be very useful for another aspect of the universe. If the universe is very uncertain, or very unsteady, or every solar system has very big different challenges, then you might really need that adaptability.
You've read Peter Watt's Blind Side, I take it, that in there he imagines interstellar species or civilization that doesn't have any introspection and is like a philosophical zombie or stochastic parrot on a civilizational scale. But I think that's what you're kind of suggesting, Robin, isn't it? That you could have something of that scale.
Huge variety.
Yeah. Or the Singularity book from Charlie Strauss, he imagines a stock market becoming the singularity basis of a new civilization, and all it wants to do is maximize profit.
I think somehow we're more free in imagining these aliens being all sorts of weird ways than just imagining our descendants being all these weird ways. But honestly, I think the range of our descendants is nearly as large. We can't be very confident about our descendants and what sort of civilization have and which part of them will dominate and what priorities they'll have. I think we're nearly as uncertain about that.
James, I was not convinced with this particular aspect of Peter Watt's discussion of blindsight. It's not plausible to me that the agents that he describes that are successful only act as if they were possessed by the need to survive and expand. Right? But it's an interesting aspect if you look at LLMs. The LLM is not necessarily trying to be the best possible agent. It's going to create a token completion that may be writing a text that is very plausible. And as such, it might create an agent that is somewhat the best one, but if the text is not about the best possible one, it's going to do something else. And there is a fundamental difference, it seems to me, in the way in which our own minds operate, because ultimately the individual cells that contribute to it will be motivated to survive at some level and persist. And the organization that emerges over them over certain time spans will probably inherit this tendency in a way, same way as an association of people will often have a tendency to survive, at least until it becomes postmodernist because it's too big to fail.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine a machine that was self-replicate? I mean, I think that's what a von Neumann machine was imagined to be, right? Something that wasn't necessarily introspective or, you know, had its own intent to colonize the universe. It was just programmed to do a thing, and that thing happened to be colonizing.
But maybe the cell is the best von Neumann machine.
Well, it's always dependent on the environment, what is the best for Neumann. Cells are really, really great on Earth right now. And they have been for a few billion years. They're rather crappy on the moon and most asteroid surfaces of the rest of the solar system. But the interesting part is, of course, we're trying to fix that, mostly by making containers for cells. So we're using our own conglomerates of cells in the hands and making tools and building these containers and trying to send containers with cells out. And indeed, Cole and Zembrovsky and others, they came up with this concept in the 60s and 70s of macro life, that actually we should probably actually regard a spaced habitat with the ecosystem, the people, and the technology as a kind of eukaryotic cell, taking in the prokaryotic of the individual species and self-replicating a space. It's a new level of life. They called it macro life. And I think there is something interesting about that, because it's a very big ecological niche. If you can actually make it in the asteroid belt, you can probably make it in any asteroid belt across the Milky Way and other galaxies. The ecological niche would be vast. So once life somehow gets there, then that expands and probably takes over rather naturally. And then it might, of course, do all sorts of weird different things, because different parts of it might have very different goals. So you end up with this phase transition of matter where a lot of it gets incorporated into these kind of systems. But life generally has so many different options on how it expresses itself in the phenotype. So you can't even explore the full genotype space because there's not enough time in the universe. And we should expect the same kind of diversity of macro life in the universe.
Can I bring us back to the three-body problem? Point out that basically three-body problem succeeds somewhat in getting viewers or readers to identify with Earth as a whole and identify with a long scope of Earth history via the mechanism of threat from aliens. If we don't think that's plausible, which I don't think any of us do, at least certainly on that time scales, what is the prospect for getting people on Earth to see themselves as part of a civilization that lasts over a long time and care about the trajectory of that? Do we have other emotionally compelling approaches other than making up aliens and getting people scared of them?
if people live long enough, they'll care about the future more.
If they maintain identities over those long time lives,
Well, yeah.
which they may not, they may just change a lot across long time scales.
The way we go into the future is we have children, because we have difficulty to adapt our organisms in situ to changing circumstances, and we also cannot maintain the organization of our organisms for a very long time. So if it's possible that we can change this by switching to different substrates and changing our organization, but arguably that would make us no longer people. We would be something else. And so as long as we are humans, we procreate. And at the moment, many of us have stopped doing this, because I think that we have lost the belief in going into the future.
In three-body problem, when the people have to dehydrate, you can either take them and store them for rehydration later, or you can eat them or burn them. And I think, and it was an interesting reflection about civilizational continuity. It's like, all of us are going to make contributions to civilization, and people have the choice whether to just throw that away or preserve it somehow.
Generally, I think the idea of a cosmopolitan view, that actually we are all in this together, there is a thing called civilization, but bigger than our nationality. It might even be that we don't regard Western civilization and Chinese civilization as separate. Actually, we're now part of the same big global, whatever to call that, meta-civilization. These ideas, of course, have grown over time. And one reason is, of course, ease of travel and communication. The Roman Empire had a hard time conceiving of a unity with other civilizations, because they were always very, very foreign, or just somebody you could invade. So the other parts of the world were always kind of in the darkness of the early civilization game when you play, and you don't even see the rest. Today, we're still kind of stumbling about having a global civilization. But it's much easier to say, oh, actually, we humans are actually fairly similar. I went on a holiday and I met people, and they were very foreign and had weird culture, but I also did recognize a lot of similarities. I did notice that artwork that spoke to me, etc. I think we're establishing more means for recognizing the other. And I don't know whether this is a Peter Singer style expansion of circles of concern, or whether it's just the natural interaction with others.
I think we are, in fact, more similar, and we do have more things in common, but that doesn't mean we emotionally care about it or think about it and identify with it. That's more what I was asking about the two-body problem.
Yeah. So we might, if we were sort of living in the African savannah. I mean, we don't really interface with other species very often, except when they're pets, and we share goals, or they want food and we feed them. There aren't many natural threats in terms of other agents in the environment other than humans that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis that is worth serious consideration. Maybe a spider, or a housefly or a snake. I don't know. Like these sorts of things don't really present themselves as problems as much as they did in the past. So yeah, I get it that we don't viscerally feel from day to day that there could be other agents out there that are very different from us, that have very different goals, but our ancestors may have.
That's the Watchmen plot, right? We need an alien invasion, so we might as well invent one.
In many cases, it's because it actually lends itself to good drama, and it's a very simple story, and it might also be a warning, because this is a classic trick, of course, for bad political leaders to create enough unity so we don't question too much what they were up to in that corruption scandal or something else. Let's invade some random neighboring place instead. So it's a kind of warning against using fear as a unifier. But it's also much harder to tell a story about how we got together because of music and shared commonalities. There are a few stories like that, but they don't create as much fun drama.
The three-body problem at least gives you a reason not only to think of Earth as one, but also to think on many, centuries-long timescales. And that's hard to do. It's like the biggest thing we ever see around in our world today about that is like global warming or something. So if you can get people worried about global warming, you can get them thinking about several centuries, but otherwise they just don't think about it. And that's unfortunately a weaker motivation than many think. And so the question is, how can we get people to identify not just with civilization, but with the long long trajectory of civilization to care about it at all, to worry about whether it might go wrong. We just seem to lack ways to connect people emotionally about that.
If we found that there was a planet-killing asteroid that was going to whack us in 400 years, I presume that we would come together well enough to stop that. But
in 380 years, we would.
Yeah, in 300, maybe.
So would we do it now?
Yeah, but I don't necessarily think it would keep us all together. It would keep us together for that, but it wouldn't keep us together for everything else.
In a way, I think global warming is a benchmark, because there is a significant majority of the educated parts of our society that believe that global warming was an existential threat for a long time. And yet we have not been able to muster a very coordinated response. Right? This is true regardless of whether you think that global warming is an existential threat or not. I think most of us agree that most people, many people in our civilization think it is.
Well, people don't trust the consensus of experts. There's a distrust in it. Well, it's not a distrust, but people just don't really feel like they need to trust experts.
Yes, but the experts also did not collaborate, and most of the people who go to climate conferences and policy meetings are experts.
So the interesting thing is the time perspective. Generally, when talking about sustainability, I noticed that people into it, they typically start talking about the long time scale for various natural processes, replenishing resources. And then we quickly move to a very short time scale, because now it's urgent to fix the civilization, so we become more sustainable. And that might make sense, of course, because we might need to fix that urgently. Yet the sustainability people very rarely talk about the end game. They get very confused when I ask them, so what is the end game? How is this supposed to work for a civilization in 1 million years? Because generally, we don't allow ourselves to think very far. Some of it is just because it's hard to predict the future, so it's so uncertain that actually having a long planning horizon might be stupid. We allow that for a few things. Nuclear waste is a very interesting and glaring example where people suddenly allow themselves an imaginary nuclear semiotics is a thing. There are all these ideas about how to store the waste in a way that future generations can understand and be fearful of in the right way. In practice, it's not done like that, but enough people have been working on it, so it's almost a modern myth. We don't do this for other long-term environmental risks like heavy metal poisoning, which is really telling us something about how irrational we are about it. But I think we can build on this. The Long Now Foundation, they have been trying to push for the idea that we should regard now as a 10,000-year interval. I, of course, think that that's way too short. I want to think in billion-year intervals. Every time I go past the rocks outside this building, I kind of pet them. They were formed 2.1 billion years ago when my ancestors were just barely eukaryotes. And that's kind of a nice feeling of solidity. They're from freaking supercontinents ago.
Cixin Liu's second most popular novel or movie is The Wandering Earth. And it's about discovering that the sun is going to go out on us. And so Earth is no longer going to be habitable. And basically, in his narrative, the CCP leads the world to decide which half of us get to survive. And that half moves below the surface into this new spaceship Earth, and the other half just freezes to death on the outside. But then they strap rockets on the one side of the planet and start blasting us to a new star home. But I like the imagination about all of the Earth coming together to solve these problems. But in this particular case, he does imagine genociding half of the planet as a part of the plan.
It's not how I remember the story.
Really?
Yes, the rockets were built around the equator of Earth. So the entire Earth was rotated evenly. It's just, of course, the surface of the Earth gets very cold because we are leaving our orbit before the sun explodes. And the reason why a lot of people die is a lot of people do not act in a coordinated manner. And so it's not that China decides that everybody else dies. It's that China is at the forefront of those who make that movement to get the Earth to survive. And so it's again this modernist perspective where you have authoritarian modernist state who has coordinated action and the others can only look up to it.
Right. You're right.
But the Wandering Earth is mostly displaying us as weak because we are not coordinated, and China is strong because it is coordinated. And from the perspective of a coordinated authoritarian modernist society, that makes sense, right? And even if we disagree with it.
Yeah, no, you're right. That is the narrative.
The countervailing story would, of course, be a story about how diversity actually solves the day by doing a lot of different things. But unfortunately, that is a hard story to tell, because now you need to show ingenuity, which is already hard, and also a lot of different people trying a lot of different things, which is hard to follow. But that's, of course, typically the actual story of why a lot of market systems are very successful at solving even problems that seem very weird. There are a few examples of that, like Mark Miller's Earth Web, which is pretty hopeless as a story and a novel, but really fun as an idea of, okay, information markets and forecast market to actually create a collective intelligence to solve, indeed, an alien invasion problem.
That's Mark Stiegler.
Mark Stiegler, sorry, yes, mixing up the marks here.
Don't you think nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction in general are already a civilization uniting challenge that we have failed?
Yeah, well, I was just about to bring up the sword holder program within Sitch and Liu's three-body problem was really a representation of mutually assured destruction. So yes,
that's how it concludes.
Great question. Yeah.
Yep.
So one of the interesting things about the Cold War and mutual assured destruction was it was, in some sense, the killer app for game theory. It literally ran the world for many decades and had a very profound effect on how the world was implemented. The realization that deterrence, which of course was known by military commanders for a long time, could actually be globalized and set up as a very stable equilibrium. Then, of course, the problem is this works great if you have two nuclear powers. Three, okay, yeah, we can still handle it. Okay, the French, yeah, they're mostly on our side. And then, of course, we end up in Tom Leary's song, Who's Next? What happens when Alabama gets the bomb?
It also needs to be that weapons of mass destruction are attributable to those firing them. If you don't know who's firing the weapons, then you don't know who to retaliate against or mutually assure destruction with.
Yeah, and indeed, if you had a good enough countermeasure, it all blows up. If there are ways of surviving, or even just somebody is irrational, the list of assumptions going into that equilibrium is fairly long. And it probably made a lot of sense from the start, partially because it was the least bad solution. But of course, in a more complex world, this doesn't work. I'm rather optimistic about avoiding that kind of equilibrium on the very largest scales. Once you're kind of spreading on cosmological scales, even triggering vacuum decay can't destroy all of your settled space because the shockwave will never catch up with some part. But now you need to be literally working on billion light year scales. So depending on the density of inhabitation in the universe, this might or might not be possible.
But so far, nukes have been a roaring success. Right? The predictions of their most optimist defenders who argued for their creation have panned out. We have prevented World War III. And without nukes, we quite certainly would have had a World War III and would have seen a devastation of Europe in the last 60 years, at least once. And as a result of nukes, we got an unprecedented era of prosperity and success for human civilization on Earth. None of the nuclear powers are waging escalating wars against each other, and so far it's working. It could argue that the risk is not worth it, because if it goes wrong, it might provide an existential risk to humanity in a way that World War III would not. But so far, the threshold for building nukes has been so high that the governments that are able to deploy them tend to be rational governments and do not escalate in this way. And but I'm not arguing for or against nukes here. I just want to point out that the supporters or people who were in favor of nukes so far are arguably right. It works.
How do you build fault tolerance around nuclear weapons accidentally being detonated in such a way that it looks like it was an intentional thing? looked like it might have been a dirty bomb. There's been scenarios where nukes have dropped out of the backs of trucks and haven't exploded because part of their circuitry had decayed or rusted or oxidized over time. There's Stanislav Petrov and a bunch of others who have sort of circumvented the protocols to stop an exchange of nuclear weapons. Of nuclear bombs.
If one nuke went off per year for the next 1,000 years, Earth would be fine. Civilization would go on. I mean, it would be a cost. It would be bad. I'm not recommending it, but that level of nuclear use isn't the issue. The issue is if you use 10,000 all in a few days, then we are facing a much bigger problem. So I'm not actually that worried about a few accidents once in a while.
Well, how do you avoid the cascade effects from an accidental nuclear error looking like an intentional one, right? How do you deal with the cascade effects?
But the interesting part here seems to be that this is what the systems actually are trying to handle. There are a lot of safeguards on nukes themselves, just like the military generally don't like bombs going off by accident, because the military is usually close to bombs. So they have a very direct interest in making this equipment as safe as possible. Now, the big problem is false alarms. And there is no real data on how often you get false alarms. There are some incidental reasons that makes me think that they're actually fairly common, which suggests that you actually have a structure behind it that is now not very willing to just launch because you're getting signals. So at least as long as the international situation is such that it's very unlikely that there is an intentional preemptive strike, this system seems to be surprisingly robust. But still, the estimates by Seth Baum and others seems to suggest that, one chance in 100,000 per year of an accidental nuclear war, that seems hard to rule out. And many people, even military planners, say, that's actually too high. We don't accept that risk. We would actually like to get it down, although in practice, it doesn't seem that they have been doing anything, but maybe in secret, they have actually been trying to handle that despite the high incidence of false alarms. The real problem might be, of course, if we get other technologies that don't have the nice properties of nukes. Nukes are chunky, require special equipment to make, they're very expensive. Getting something that would be very cheap is the kind of standard technological existential risk nightmare scenario. There might also be things that are naturally lacking attribution. Earlier, Joscha mentioned Stanislav Lem's story, his master's voice. And at one point in the story, it looks like there is a way of teleporting energy in a way that would allow you to have an untraceable weapon mass destruction. And the people involved in the project are absolutely horrified by the implications. Fortunately, it turns out that it doesn't work because of some math reason, but they felt like they were very, very close to finding a truly dangerous information hazard. And we don't know whether stuff like that is likely to exist hidden away in physics. So this might be another reason to keep an eye on the physicists, although I still think it's the AIs that we want to keep an eye on.
My default vision of the future in the last 6 months or so has changed to be focused on the problem Joscha mentioned, which is fertility is going to continue to fall, population will peak and then decline, and then innovation will grind to a halt, and then we may have several centuries of basically a pause in innovation, after which we'll have small mainline civilization who may be displaced by Haredi or Amish or something like that. And so, but then civilization would rise again, rise and fall and rise and fall. And so I'm more focused maybe on what can last through one of these cycles. For example, what happens to nukes when the world is much smaller and poorer and no longer is able to invent much new technology? How will they manage all these really old nukes? And would that cause, and if the world fragments into many less coordinated nations, then, how does that play out? That's the kind of scenario I'm focused on now, that is not projecting our current civilization to keep rising at the rate it has and quickly go high, but to rise and fall and rise and fall.
Cargo cults around missile silos. I think that's where we're headed.
Well, there is the classic scene, of course, of Return to the Planet of the Apes, worshipping the Omega bomb. But I think Edward Gibbons, in his Fall of the Roman Empire, had an interesting point about this. He was arguing that when a civilization falls, and of course he was kind of setting the tropes for this, his archaeology and scholarship and history might be debated today, but he had an interesting argument that the technologies that survive, they're not the really fancy ones taking a lot of resources or for the elite, because that's hard to do. It's the thing that the village blacksmith does, because they're practically useful. They are the ones that actually people use. And he argued that that kind of agricultural implements, etc., had a ratchet effect. You would, over time, accumulate more and more things like the sickle and the plow, and they would be retained. So even if civilization cycle, he expected this ratcheting effect to keep on building up stuff.
So maybe nukes aren't in that category, nor maybe our LLMs. But I don't think we'll lose electricity or running water. So I think that sort of stuff will last. So that would definitely be an improvement. So that's a key question I ask about our current civilization. Which of these things could last through a downturn? Which were sort of elite, very expensive, high coordination things, and which can be mass used.
Could computation, the style of computers that we have today, could they last a civilizational collapse? Are you saying like a
can
collapse?
AI prevent this collapse? I
Yes.
think that we will not be able to run fabs if we don't have a technological civilization, because it does require too many different areas of expertise, too many types of raw materials, too much large-scale coordination to basically build semiconductor factories. And
I think a risk is that even though we don't do it now, it'll probably be possible at a relatively low extra cost to just make very durable computers. And once they do make a lot of very durable computers, the industry that makes them might go away, because the world has plenty of durable computers and the economy is shrinking. And so then there'll be this world of lots of durable computers slowly breaking, but still plenty, and forgetting how to make them, I guess, for a while.
It's also important to recognize that
become
silicon chips are very, very tricky to make. You can make a computer out of relays. That is something you can, as long as you have metal wiring and a bit of iron, you can actually do it by hand.
Yes, but you cannot run an LLM on them. But
Not
the
an
present
LLM,
generation
but you can do
of software will not be running on this. We can get a pocket calculator this way.
Yep. And the pocket calculator is very, very useful and for a lot of purposes. I think we are a little bit addicted to having very nice and fancy computers today. We should recognize that actually even a crappy, crude computer is a very useful tool for many societies. That is actually like not necessarily the village blacksmith, but this is something that you actually want to make in the capital, especially when you're aware of what a computer is, what the concepts are, things like binary logic and gates, etc. Once you know about them, they're fairly obvious how to build it. You can kind of reconstruct it fairly easily. So while the silicon chips might be fancy and while we might want to retain those robust computers, it's worth recognizing that I think actually computing is going to be with us even under future downturns.
But vast amounts of very bloated software, they just may get thrown away, right? You must have a much higher premium on elegant, very efficient software.
That's how we finally get rid of legacy software.
Yeah, well.
Eventually, that's the only way of getting rid of it. But I'm still wondering if millions of years of future, deep down in whatever the counterpart of computers they have, there's still kind of remnants of the POSIX kernel, and the epoch is of course still January 1, 1970, for reasons nobody understands, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, we have to save the zero-day exploits so we can use them against future AGIs.
We're all implying that there is going to be a plateau with LLMs, right? So you don't think that in 2 years from now we will be at the point where an LLM is going to write an operating system from scratch on demand?
No.
And will prevent the downfall?
If
I don't know.
Full human level AI would prevent the economy from falling with human population collapse. That would definitely do it. I bet it won't happen, but I would love for it to be wrong. That would be great.
Well, are you predicting that there's a serious likelihood, I mean, an overwhelming likelihood that the civilization will fall in 2 years?
No, in 200.
Okay, in 200 years, right? Okay, so you don't think future LLMs or whatever neural networks are even better than LLMs in the future won't be able to sort of
Replace most human labor? No, I'm betting they will.
replace most human labor, or even redesign itself to be able to run on very efficiently on computation.
So I've
So
done the
we'll
estimate.
Yep.
Say, if you imagine a continued exponential growth of technology as we've seen, and imagine some date that's the equivalent of the rise and then fall integrated out to a long time, my rough estimate of that is 80 years. So you've got roughly 80 years more of innovation of the sort we've seen before you run out in a pause. So the question is, will we have full human level AI in 80 years if we had continued growing? And my guess is no, but I'd be happy to be wrong.
In some ways,
pessimistic.
it's greater. In some ways, AI is already vastly outstripping human capabilities right now. Which areas would you say?
I mean, in terms of doing most human jobs. That's, from the economist, that's the relevant standard. When can they replace humans on pretty much all job tasks? At that point, the economy can keep growing even without humans. Without that happening, then humans go away, then the economy declines.
Adam, I don't think that we're there yet. I think that for a few years now, the AI models are better at AI criticism than human AI critics. I haven't seen an argument against AI that could not be generated by GPT-3. Better by GPT-3. But I also have not seen an AI program that is better at AI research than AI researchers to actually try to make advances. And arguably, that is the criterion for when we can go to the beach.
You don't think that the humanoid robotics that we're seeing this, come online this year are going to be pretty impressive? I think that they have a lot of capabilities that could replace jobs.
Yeah, I'm also thinking that 80 years, that's a long time in computing. Yeah. That's actually about the length of history of computing so far. We're right at the middle on this interval. But then again, sometimes computing moves more slowly than one expects. I had this realization that made me feel very old, that my first computer is closer in time to Alan Turing and his Bomber computer than to the present. That made me feel very old. And then I realized, to my horror, oh no, I've been using computers more than half of the time they have existed. And certainly they have become much, much, much better. But when I look back at the heroic early work on making them into a thing, it felt like that was where the big revolutions are. Things haven't changed that much since then. Then, of course, the third thought is that's not actually true. There is actually a tremendous amount of stuff going on under the hood of even a vanilla computer, but we don't notice it. And we're having this imaginary leveling off when actually the rate is higher. So one of the big problems is that it's very hard to appreciate just how quickly things are moving. Partially because a lot of the low-hanging fruits have been picked, so we're not noticing actually how much effort it takes.
Well, yes, I mean, with the current computation, it makes the higher fruit lower, easier to pick. So we're ratcheting off the gains. It doesn't look like it's very, very profound, but yeah, our computers can do amazing things. Sorry, Joscha.
I think that in the first 80 years, modern physics made a lot of progress, and then arguably it stopped. Maybe computing could be like this. So not sure either way. I'm still of the mind that I would be very surprised if we see a rapid leveling off. I think that we have not implemented the main principles of how minds work and how they are self-organizing on human brains. So far, we are still scaling up the perceptron, and most of the ideas that we currently see coming to fruition are ideas that were already formulated in the 1960s. And
if you don't look at computer research, if you just look at actual jobs and machines displacing people on jobs, I did a statistical analysis looking at all the jobs in the US from 1999 to 2019. And each one, we had a measure of how automated they were in different years. And over that period, the degree of automation changed by 1/3 of a standard deviation overall on average. There was no correlation in changes in automation and whether there was more or less jobs or more or less wages. And the predictors of which jobs were more automated didn't change at all over those 20 years. So on that basis, I just say we're in this long, slow, gradual process of automating things, and we have a long way to go. Third of a standard deviation in 20 years.
During a stable era, but not during a chaotic era, Robin.
Okay, well, if there are
At the moment, we have
Planets
added
of
mostly
automation
jobs in
whizzing around.
government. In the last few years, we have created a lot of jobs in the administration. I don't think that's necessarily because administration is so complicated and it's becoming more and more complicated. I think you cannot optimize fake jobs, right? This will never happen. And we have a lot of incentives to put people into jobs that pay them. I suspect that a large part of the economy is already de facto an employment program.
Bullshit jobs. Yeah.
Yeah, then you could make
worried that
billions.
we
Just
might
start a
get even
company and
more
cut all
of
those
this
bullshit
in there.
jobs, right? Make billions. Go ahead, prove it. All it takes to prove that most jobs are bullshit is to start a company where you don't have the bullshit jobs in your company. You sell a competing product, but the other companies have bullshit jobs, and you make money hand over fist.
No,
Please do it.
half
But
of the
it's
economy
not-
is
it's
the
not a
government.
strategy,
It's
but
not
we have
individual
seen that-
economy anymore. We just
We have
love
seen that
capitalism.
historically. Whenever an industrial sector is started, the form of that industrial sector is more or less continuous through time. You know, like the textile mills today are still structured pretty much like textile mills were back in the day. The new forms of organization come when new industries get started. So I agree with you that it's hard to just say, okay, get rid of all the bullshit jobs. But if, like in higher education, if someone comes along and figures out how to do all this without expensive professors and DEI and all the rest of it, then they'll do it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The way you show bullshit jobs are bullshit is you do without them and show
Right.
that you don't need them, right?
But it may be an entirely
almost
new
nobody does
model.
that these days. So I got to say, I mean, honestly, Elon Musk and Twitter, he apparently showed that a lot of Twitter jobs are bullshit. I mean, I guess I'll go with that. He made it keep working with 10% of the previous employees. So
I'm just wondering if this will play out the same way if we do get like a higher degree of automation in AI, such that AI does start to take over jobs in a way that displaces human labor. Will humans still be kept around, even though there's AI agents out there that are performing more cost effectively, just for the sake of bullshit jobs?
well, that's the competition question we talked about earlier, right? In a world of strong competition, yeah, the humans get shunned aside. In a world with less strong competition, maybe they get to stay around. That is the key question about the future.
Under this view, would you then say that we'd still go through the same stagnation period of lack of innovation?
Again, if you can make machines that wholesale substitute for humans all across the economy, then the economy can keep growing even without the humans, and human population decline no longer limits the growth of the economy. I don't think we're there, and my guess is we won't be there in 80 years either.
You know, when India's population surpassed China, the Chinese state spokesman who was asked about it, he said, yeah, but our population's higher quality, which of course was insulting.
True.
But I think there's a point there, which is, you know, even if we had half as many people on the planet, if they were all well-fed, well-educated, fully enhanced, you know, to the capabilities that we have, they would be 10 times more productive than the poorly educated folks we have now.
I mean, the problem is just like our world population might not be the optimum number, and maybe the optimum number is half or a quarter of what it is now. But the forces that are causing fertility decline, population decline, won't stop at that number. If they're on a downward trajectory in population, they will just keep going down as long as the same cultural forces are in place. They won't stop at your magic number. There's really no place they will stop at until some other culture displaces them.
It's interesting that this is an example of a civilizational trajectory that is much more easy to wrap one's head around than many of the more speculative trajectories I've been writing about. Because at least in the transhumanist literature, there are these ideas that we have a trajectory that might lead to extinction, one that goes off to infinity with some singularity, and maybe some space thing, and then maybe if you squint, some oscillatory one. But of course, they are all based on assuming various things that we don't necessarily see, while the population one is an interesting one, because even if somebody doesn't agree with you, Robin, it still seems to be a trajectory you can discuss. And it's interesting because we can even try to analyze what the kind of forces that generate it. Unfortunately, I think macro history has had a bad reputation academically over the past few decades. I argue that it was Popper's fault. He launched his grand broadside against socialism and fascism, and unfortunately also hit macro history by his criticism of historicism. So that's kind of collateral damage, and sadly, people have not been trying to do a good job of seeing what can you say well about historical patterns with some rigor. It might be coming back now, but it's been several decades where nobody has dared talking about it.
James?
Well, I just wanted to mention to Anders there, I just saw a paper where they were using LLMs programmed to do cooperation games. And
Oh, yeah.
did you see that too? They basically said, okay, you're going to be a cooperator to one LLM and you're going to be a competitor. And then they put them through a bunch of cooperation games and saw how their personalities and strategies evolved. But I'm kind of excited about the idea of, this is connecting to your macro history stuff, I'm kind of excited about the idea of simulate or social simulations as an avenue towards macro sociological speculation.
But I think that could be very useful. There is a deep question that I've been wondering about, and that is basically, what is the structure of history? What is its fractal dimension? So there is this feeling that you quite often get when reading history that, okay, there are some pivotal points where things could have gone very differently. There are other parts of history that actually seems to be relatively stable. But it's very unclear whether this is actually true. It's very hard to run counterfactuals well in history. If we could actually make decent simulations and start approximating closer and closer to real history, we might actually be able to tell a bit more about how lumpy is history, how many of these pivotal points are there, is there some fractal distribution, or is it actually it's just big forces? Actually being better at understanding what the big forces are, or even detecting them in data, would be tremendously valuable.
People have been doing simulations
what
in
might
social
happen in the
science
future.
for many decades. The usual limitation is that there are just too many degrees of freedom, too many different ways to set the parameters for these simulations, and it's hard to validate to an audience that you've done that well. That, I think, has been the major reason why we don't do a lot more simulations. We just don't know which ones to run because we don't know which ones to believe. And faster computers won't help with that.
Personally, I'm not as worried about population decline, but it's mostly because I still believe in evolution. I suspect that the decline that we are seeing is the result of certain cultures that were adaptive at certain times and are maladaptive right now from the perspective of replacing the headcount. At the moment, if you are a middle-class person in one of the industrialized society, you try not to have too many children because you don't want to drop an economic status. You don't want to insert your children to a lower economic stratum than yourself. This does not apply at people at the top and at the bottom of the economic strata, which largely reproduce much better than the middle class. And I suspect that for as long as we will be able to feed babies, there will be takers. It just is going to be different segments of the population, and it might take a few generations for different subcultures to catch up in filling the gaps in the mouse that can be fed. But ultimately, I would be very surprised if humanity is itself a maladaptive species that is steering itself to starving itself to death despite being able to feed itself. I suspect it's not an economical problem, it's a cultural problem.
It is a cultural problem, but say the Roman Empire declined for 3 centuries, mainly due to insufficient population fertility, and Christians eventually took over the Roman Empire by doubling every 20 years for 3 centuries, starting from a very tiny group. That's the sort of future we have. Yes, eventually, if we give the Amish a couple of centuries, then, or they're ready, they will replace us and growth will happen again. But if you wanted to pass on our values to that next civilization, it becomes much harder because these different subcultures have quite different values.
These values are the maladaptive stuff. Of course, they will disappear.
Right, but the question is then, what is it that you want to influence about the future, and how do you do it if your civilization is going to decline and go away and be replaced by some very different ones who are very hostile really to yours?
The universe was never about us.
I think that's actually an interesting aspect also about really good science fiction. It's actually wrestling with questions like, what if the universe wasn't about us? There are some of the more interesting aspects in science fiction when playing around with that in different unexpected ways. Of course, the classical modernist science fiction was grappling with that transition. Oh, the universe is not intended for us. We just happen to live here, but we might shape it into something nice. And then there is more postmodern ones that are playing around with it, like Greg Egan's Distress, where actually it turns out that the universe was for us. Anthropics is actually the actual underlying physics, which is just as shocking as finding out that you're all alone in the universe. But I think really good science fiction gets you thinking about these very big topics in a good way. I've been having this long-running argument with Nick Bostrom about whether I ought to read more history books, and unfortunately he's winning. I started to realize that he's got it right. But my argument to him was he needs to read more science fiction. And he doesn't, because science fiction's main purpose, I think, is a kind of widening what you can think about. And I think many of us have probably read enough to actually have a pretty big scope. It's mostly needed for people who never thought outside the normal suburbia. That shock is very necessary to break open for bigger thinking. But then you want the history part, how weird the actual world is, and these weird things that happen in the history book have actually happened. That is a hint on how weird the future can be.
The demand for history books has been pretty constant over many centuries, but the demand for science fiction, unfortunately, has really rapid rises and falls. So, I thought when I was young, science fiction made sense to read and I liked it, but I didn't quite understand how the appeal of it was tied to the culture I was in at the time. Say the Cold War set up this framing of the entire Earth and the entire civilization and a desire to fight over it, and a desire to think what would happen along timescales if technological competition continued. But since then, the interest in science fiction has greatly declined, and think in part because people aren't so engaged by that sort of vision. They don't identify naturally with whoever is the most technologically capable in a story. If you present them some future, that they are not so sure why they should identify with these characters in this weird future world in a way that I thought I could identify because I could map them onto this grand vision I was taught. But that's, in some sense, our major challenge here. Since we're people interested in the future, how do we present an emotionally compelling framing such that people will be interested actually in hearing our projections or stories about these larger timescales and larger social scales that they actually don't naturally care about?
Asimov's Foundation was allegedly based on Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon, and it's interesting that when they adapted it for television, I think they did relatively successfully. It came up with the idea that you had to have some of the characters continue through time so people could relate to it. So they have this cryopreserved protagonists, and then genetically engineered protagonists who are clones and everyone. But at any rate, I think that is a challenge, because the big challenge with Foundation and with all that kind of macro galactic sociology is how do people care? When it's at that scale, it's just like the natural laws of the universe instead of a drama you can get your teeth into.
Well, yeah, I mean, people identify with history a lot more than they can identify with possible futures, because there's, they've got ancestors in their history. The culture that they live in is a descendant of that history. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard to identify with science fiction because people don't have that sort of grounding in the future yet. I think we should be watching more science fiction or reading more science fiction.
I got it backwards. Science fiction is the expression of which part of society and to which degree and in which way is thinking and about the future and resonating with it. It's basically the expression of that link. And so the degree to which science fiction resonates in society is the degree to which people who read care about these questions.
I gotta say, the most popular science fiction, it's like, say, Star Wars or Star Trek, or even Dune, is mostly people are engaged by a certain fictional scenario and they've come to like those characters and like that world, and then they want to continue engaging with that fictional fantasy world, which doesn't usually have much to do with the real future. So
I
most
think
of
that might be
science
true for
fiction,
Star Wars, which is basically Lord of the Rings in a different scenario, but I don't think it's true for Dune. Arguably, Villeneuve is telling Dune in such a way that he is engaging with a larger audience. The main cast is not the main Dune characters, but he picks people that would get people into the movie that normally wouldn't see it, and as such makes it financially viable. But Dune itself is something that I think it's the best political science fiction in existence, probably. And
It still has
not
almost
making
nothing
many
to do with our real
compromises
future.
for the readers.
The point is, if you wanted people to care about the future, this isn't working because these aren't representations of the future. They are things set in future-like places, and they are stories people are engaged by, and they might have metaphorical, lessons that would be useful lessons to know, say, about politics, but that could be true for lots of other fantasy stories.
I think it also depends on the subgenre of science fiction. So hard science fiction has quite often gone for the high concept. They are actually trying to talk about the future, the physical universe, but it also is a rather small niche because most people don't really like to read too much about the engineering details. There are some of us who do, and some of us even try to write out the differential equations Greg Egan have in incandescence. He literally said that you understand the story better if you solve the equations yourself, which is funny, of course, but it's not mass market. There are other stories, of course, that are very much like fantasy set in space and morality plays. I think there is also various aspects, both sociological science fiction or political science fiction. It actually has a lot of subgenres, and it's just being lumped together because it's in the same genre. But we're actually trying to tell very, very different stories. And it might be that the science fiction that broadens the mind and really gets you thinking about the future properly, it's a relatively rare thing inside the genre, but it's found even less, I think, outside the genre.
I'm going to have to sign off, guys, but it was delightful. Thank you for inviting me, Adam, and I hope I didn't impose too much, Joscha.
Not at all.
Thanks.
I thought
It's really good to have a
that you
social
didn't
audience.
impose more. I would like to hear more about your perspectives on Christian transhumanism, for instance. One of the few things I know you for, or I've heard about you, and would have liked to go more into those directions. But great that we met here.
Yeah.
Let's
Next
do it
time
again.
we should just reiterate this in various forms in the future.
Yeah, we don't need a TV series to do this. Just FYI.
I'd love to talk about Lem. Lem is one of my favorite writers of all time. And very few people ever talk about him.
100%
for me, he was always bored because I grew up with him, and for me, it was the most. It's the baseline. It's just that very few things reach the baseline.
That's right. Okay, see you guys.
Thanks, James.
Yes, I'm also going to drop out.
Thanks, Joscha.
as well.
And
I have to teach soon.
Thank you, Adam, for setting this up, and I feel very honored to be in this illustrious company. Thank you all for a wonderful
It's been great
discussion.
having you all.
Nice to see
Thanks,
you.
Joscha.
Till we meet again.
Thanks, Robin. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Anders.